All right, there we go. Yeah, so I'm just going to be talking about Raku distribution best practices and some ecosystem stuff. And yeah, this talk is targeted at beginners, so there's not going to be a lot of advanced topics talked about in this. And actually, some of the stuff Leon talked about or touched upon is in here too. So I'll get started. Talk about the difference between modules and distributions. I'll try to be typically when we talk about stuff or when we talk about it in IRC, you'll see those two words used interchangeably, but I'll try to be specific during this talk. We'll talk about distribution and module interfaces, dependencies, bundling, and then we'll get to the ecosystems. And that'll be the talk. All right, so modules versus distributions. Modules are what make up a distribution. When you use X or use test, you're using a module. And then the bundle of all of those modules is what becomes the distribution. What was that?
Solve is not muted.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Ja. Den Reddit subredditen så det i sideland. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if somebody can mute solve or not. Anyway, go into interfaces. So module interface, that's talking about the piece of your module that
Hva heter det for motparten av denne? Hva kalles det for en? Socketen på engelsk. Eller på norsk. Det er du som er elektronikkpakken.
De har bein og
Du burde jo vite teknologiene. Uansett, denne duppeditten her, den har blitt så slitt at den har mistet.
Thank you. All right, so interfaces are the parts of your modules that the end user eventually interacts with. So yeah, just think very carefully about how you would want to interact with a module that does what you're writing for. Designed to the user, not the library to the problem. Kind of an easy example of that ties into Leon's talk. He's designing for the end user and not Postgres directly. His interface is clean, it's concise, it's succinct, and it doesn't remove functionality available to you from the database. So it's good design that way. As part of doing that, write tests first. You don't need to do, I'm not a huge advocate for top-down development, which is TDD in the next bullet point. And that's probably a whole topic in and of itself. But writing a few simple tests kind of helps you flesh out the idea of how you would want to interact with that module. Is it something that needs to be a class? Is it something that doesn't need to be a class? Should it just be a couple of subs? And you can kind of see that in the ecosystem now, where creating a SHA for something requires creating a class, and then you finally get to the SHA creation part, versus something where you have to pass around the context of a process, which you don't really want to do. Next step, yeah, choosing classes, procedural styles, or some kind of mix. Sometimes you write generators that generate classes, which is the case for some ORMs. Other times, procedural style is more than adequate, generating SHAs, anything like that. And then classes, which is basically anything that needs a context or some state information behind it. Yeah, be succinct. Giving a lot of options is nice, and it's good to get back to that. But on the other hand, you don't want to force your end user to provide 50 inputs when 3 would have got you there. And yeah, the last one, it's not the last one, but the last one on this slide is don't be afraid to explore and see how other modules handle tricky designs. There's a lot of stuff out in the ecosystem, especially low-level bindings where you're binding to a lib and then making that functionality available in Raku. That's really sticky. It gets really tricky to make some of those C interfaces usable in Raku, and that kind of ties into the next point. I guess I didn't put it on here. Oh no, it's the last one on here. Cascading modules for low-level bindings. Just translate the bindings directly and then write some syntax on top of those. If you're using libcrypto, that's a big one. libSSL, yeah, libyaml, all that stuff is library bindings with some sugar added to them so that it's a little more usable for the consumer of those modules. And then back to the top of this, do not reinvent the wheel. You could rewrite modules all day, and you end up spending a lot of time learning how stuff works, but not actually getting further into your problem. Typically, if the library exists and the maintainer is available and present, then you shouldn't really need to rewrite a bunch of stuff. If it's missing, 1 or 2 pieces of functionality that you need, contribute to the module. We don't need 500 modules that all do SHA-256. That said, there are times where you should rewrite it. Key functionality is missing. For instance, there's no async Postgres stuff in the DBPG module. Yeah, write a new one. That's entirely new functionality. It behaves very differently from the original module. The maintainer is AWOL. Maybe they won the lottery, whatever, and they're done with open source. Yeah, sometimes it's too much to pick up a large open source project and start trying to maintain it yourself. And then writing your own HTTP server is a great way to learn how HTTP actually works, and kind of what you can see in practice. So if you're learning and you want to do stuff at the lower level, yeah, just start writing stuff. And then, okay, cascading, yeah, I already went over that. Dependencies. Okay, when you're writing your modules, be very specific in your meta file. This is something that happens more in very, very strongly typed languages like Haskell. I wouldn't put Go in that category, but very strongly typed languages pin dependencies very strictly. And it's really something that we should be doing in the Raku ecosystem, is put the version module, put the auth, put all of that stuff into the meta 6, and that way you're sure that your module is downloading the right dependencies and you're not getting whatever Zeph or whatever found first. You're getting the module and the dist that you want. And used distribution names and not the module names. So Crow HTTP provides, several hundred other modules as part of that distribution, and you don't need to declare all of those in your meta 6, but use a specific version of Crow HTTP and declare that as your name. And you can get those names directly from Zeph when you do a search. Yeah, and as an example of that, I put Crow HTTP down there because there's a couple of those. You can get it from the Zeph ecosystem, or you can get it from CPAN. And yeah, I did a talk last year on the differences between the ecosystems, but that's a whole topic in and of itself. But the gist is you can get you can get namespace collisions from other ecosystems. So like from CPAN or P6C, it's very easy to get different versions of the same thing from, especially without very specific dist names in your Meta 6. And then native dependencies should mostly be included. The only cases I can think of where that's not the case is if you're building something that should be in Windows and a Unix-like system, it's very difficult to marry the names together between those two. Having trouble with that in Fez right now with libz, which is zlib in some places, just z in others, and yeah, it's hairy that way. In those cases, just leave it out. All right, next one is bundling. Be picky, yeah, be picky about your auth. The ecosystem that you're choosing is essentially guaranteeing that your module with your name on it is coming from you. CPAN and P6C, which is now, I think, entirely encapsulated by REA, which is the Raku ecosystem archive. You're not guaranteed that you're getting the module from the author unmodified or anything like that. It's very easy to spoof. I could easily create a, GitHub auth of Leon T and spoof his Postgres module that logs all your queries or something else. Like it's not, and yeah, nobody wants that. Be very picky about your auth. And then bundling options, yeah, I'll plug Fez. There's a few things that need to be addressed in that tool, like libz, which is coming, and there's some updates for that. MI6, that one gets a lot of love. That one's probably the original dist tool, I think, in Raku, at least as far as I know. And then manual. Yeah, it's very easy to manually upload the stuff. Eventually, yeah, you'll want to use Fez or MI6 if you're not going to REA or CPAN. And then, yeah, ecosystems I went over. Zeph was built for Raku. It handles the auth. It doesn't allow namespace collisions. The index is built in a way where you can get an index of the entire ecosystem with unique dist names available by author and version, which is the major difference between CPAN. I can upload a Raku dist to CPAN with something other than a CPAN auth. So I could spoof things on the CPAN side. And if there are name collisions, so the dist name minus the version, API, and auth keys, it won't get indexed. So if two people upload a YAML module to CPAN and the dist name without those keys is just YAML, then only the first one will get indexed in the index. Then P6C, also called REA, that's kind of the legacy one. That's where you upload your GitHub link to a file and it eventually gets indexed there. Yeah, and that's it from me. Are there any questions, any of that stuff? Clear as mud, I guess.
Well, I just want to have one remark. The REA covers all ecosystems, not just P6C.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I see. Okay, Richard, what do you got?
Unmute. Does Zeph take files in the doc that are listed in doc of the Meta 6 so Meta 6 has got a doc component, but I don't know whether Zephyr bundles those files together into the distribution.
Yeah, Fez will bundle doc files into the distribution, and it doesn't do any Meta 6 changes or anything.
Oh,
As long as your git ignore or settings in Fez don't ignore the doc directory, then it should be included in the distribution.
okay. And how would you? I'm not quite sure how you then access the doc. I know you can access resources, but is doc done accessed in a similar way?
I don't think that I don't know offhand. I don't think that there's a star question mark variable that's available to you. Maybe Liz, Matt, or Nick knows offhand.
Sorry, I missed the question.
Is there a way to get to the doc directory from your module?
Can you get what from your model?
Okay, Vadim pointed out earlier that there needs to be a system for getting documentation for modules. In Meta 6, there is a doc component, just like there's a depends and a builds component. So you can put things into a doc directory. But can you then access from within how would you access those doc files? Is there a canonical way of doing it?
I think there's
There is
a PR that Vadim is working on making all of the meta information available in a module if it's installed.
Okay.
And
Well-
if that's the case, then we can work from there.
That's not something Vadim. Well, I don't think that's connected to that PR. But to explain, like component repository installation, like it has a separate piece of logic to install each type of file. It needs logic in the core to do the same thing for document files. Like right now, you could probably list your pod files if they're separate in the provides, and they would get installed and precompiled. But I don't think the core has a way to like query for those or access those yet.
Yeah.
But all that to say, I don't think we need to wait on an external tool necessarily for that to happen. It's just some logic in the core that needs to exist to place them somewhere, which that somewhere needs to be figured out. And then like what the API for like querying for them would look like. But once we figure those type of things out, we can just implement them in Rakudo itself.
Okay.
There is also the Rakudoc command line tool, which might be a good place to also have support for that. But yeah, I agree. The more of that's in core, the better.
Yeah, and the Rakudoc tool might like be some of like we just take those ideas and put them into the core. But right now the Rakudoc is a bit it's not ideal in that it's like putting files into an implementation detail type thing. So that might just be something to draw inspiration on for the core.
I'd love to see that tool get replaced by core functionality.
Me too. That'd be nice.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out how to get doc files from locally installed distributions, because I'd like to, if I'd like to have it as a sort of local version of the Raku documentation system, but I haven't figured out how to access those doc files, even though I know they're in the module.
It sounds like it's coming. I've also written a couple of tools that kind of parse pod out of pre-comped files and is able to display those. But I think those tools, especially with the Raku AST, are definitely going to be a lot better and coming.
Yeah, that would make sense for Raku AST. I mean, basically, you would take the pod, run .ast on it, and you will have a Raku AST tree that you can just do whatever you want with it. So you don't need to do anything with pre-comps.
Yeah, sorry. That's what I mean. With the Raku AST, it makes it a lot easier to get at the pods that are already in modules, even if they're pre-comped.
Before you get to Raku AST, the problem is that if you have a precompiled module installation and its sources are removed, there is no access to separate doc files, Raku doc files. You possibly can pull in something out of modules, installed modules, if they contain the documentation. But if it's somewhere in the Docker subdirectory, no sources, no documentation. That's it. So that's part of the standard which we need to specify and implement, perhaps.
Yeah. All right, that's good info. I'm gonna move to the next question. We can chat more about module documentation in the channel. Does that kind of get you started on an answer, Richard?
Well, I think that yeah. It seems as if it's not standard that we need just to sort that out. You can get to resources, for example, but you can't get to doc.
Agreed. Yeah. All right, so we'll go to the next question. Daniel?
I just wanted to ask if you had any thoughts on sort of with pinning to exact versions and security updates, especially for sort of minor dependencies. Do you think that it is best practice to pin to an exact version and then just as a module author or a distribution author be really on the ball about checking to see if there are any updates and then updating from, 1.7.2 to 1.7.4 or whatever the sort of minor patch update is? Or do you think there is any way to specify versions that is permissive enough to pull in patch fixes or other sort of minor updates without needing to manually update all of the minor versions in the pin dependencies?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you can do away with pinning to the very minor version, but as long as you trust the module author not to make breaking changes within the scope of the minor versions, then yeah, don't pin to a minor version, but definitely still pin to how much you trust that author. And that kind of goes into using words as versions. That makes it very difficult for your end users to know whether or not your module is making a breaking change from the previous one or not.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow that last bit. What do you mean by using words as versions?
If you're just using random words as versions, then it makes it very difficult.
I see. Yeah.
May I add the answer? Because there is better approach, I think. That's why we have API for. We have API version, which is fixed at certain set of functionality you provide. Within same API version, you can have different module versions with security updates. So if your dependency specify what API you want exactly, then version could be any version, which would automatically pick up the latest one with likely security fixes.
Yes, that is the idea behind API. My experience with that is not been that people are using it that way. API gets declared as star depending on what ecosystem it's coming from. It's always the same with minor version, major version changes, stuff like that. So yeah, it goes back to know who the author is and use what makes sense from the perspective of the author. If every module version they have is API 1, API is an unreliable way to verify that you're not going to get breaking changes.
Then we need to encourage people to use API, promote it in blog posts, for example. It's there for purpose and it's very useful. So
Agreed.
And an API is introspectable at the class level in a way that other versions aren't, is that correct? Or am I confused about how API works?
It does. You can get version, alts, and API from the meta object. It's available.
Yeah. Does it answer your question, Daniel? All right, cool.
It does. It raises more questions about how we can, as a community, standardize either in semantic versioning or use of API. But I think that's a broader conversation. Thank you.
All right, thanks. And then Anton.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm not sure, is this a question, more of a reaction to something you mentioned about designing for the user, right? And
yep.
I mean, that's a huge topic, right? It's like, because who are your users in Raku, right? And to some extent, I'm kind of designing for myself 2 months after this project. So if I don't touch it, like, am I going to actually, be relatively quickly figure out what to do, and etc. And so documentation becomes essential. And I've been talking about it before, right? But detailed documentation with workflows, how exactly, like a cookbook type of documentation, what exactly you're doing, what is this? And some kind of clear mission statement behind these packages. Unfortunately, if I take this perspective, sometimes I produce too many packages, right, with too fine granularity. But especially with some system like Raku, I would rather have packages that don't depend too much on each other. Like, say, if I was doing this, I work for Wolfram Research, right? Mathematica, right? If I'm doing this in Mathematica, I don't care. Actually, I'll put all functionalities in one package, not all, but I wouldn't have this kind of perspective on separation of duties. And so the other thing I would like to mention is that to some extent, I don't know many people who use Raku for data wrangling tasks, or for machine learning or anything like that. And in some sense, for me, reprogramming into Python is one way to actually validate the Raku designs. And I haven't seen the challenges you listed in the Raku ecosystem in Raku itself, but I have seen that in Python, right? Like, I mean, it's all this name collision, whatever, right? It's kind of choosing names, etc., etc. And, I mean, it's, I have to say, this kind of checklist would be really nice to kind of have somewhere. Your presentation, like providing a checklist, would be really nice to have somewhere in the main documentation side.
That's good feedback. Yeah, maybe I'll make a blog post and kind of update the Raku docs with some of that. All right, I think that's it from me.